Testing. Good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to give you a heads up that we're going to just wait 2 or 3 more minutes for people to kind of join us. So if you want to rush off to the restroom or whatever, or get some water, then we'll get started in about 2 or 3 more minutes. I'm going to stand. Alex standing. I don't like this. Yeah, I feel like I'm in an examination. Good? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for all joining what will be the most exciting panel of this entire summit, right? And that's going to involve all of us, right? And to also make it as exciting as possible, there's a kind of unplugged quality about this panel. I've actually not met any of these people before. Had like maybe 5 minutes with Megan and a couple more minutes with the other 2 people. And we also lost one of our panelists. She not lost, but she couldn't make it in the end. But we're ready to present to you and talk to you about this exciting topic, which has to do with carbon removal technology, budgeting, and carbon markets and tools for net zero alignment. My name is Calvin Kwek. I run the Nature Finance program at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group, and I know lots about this topic. I started studying it 2 days ago, so I'm here as much as a student as many of us as well. Maybe just to give a bit of background to myself, and then I'll hand it over to each of the panelists to give a bit of introduction, and I'll start with some introductory remarks. I'm from Singapore, and I've spent the last 15 years living in Beijing. Recently moved to Oxford, where I work on this topic. Prior to this, I was working at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, working in development finance. Prior to that, also Greenpeace in China. And then before that, I was at Citibank in Singapore. It's been a great ride. And so here I am. Maybe pass it off to Cindy, and then we'll hand it off, and then I'll give some introductory comments, okay?
Thank you so much, Calvin. Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy. Except Dan sitting on the front row, I don't think I've met anyone else in this room, but I'm excited to meet and have conversations with you afterwards. I'm a researcher at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. I've been working at LSE and Oxford for the past 2.5 years, and I used to study here as well. So this specific building holds very kind of nerve-inducing memories for me. I took most of my exams I think it was in the South School, so this room is good. My specific nerdy interests are carbon markets, particularly Article 6. So if you have any questions on those, please let me know at the end. I'm happy to talk about corresponding adjustments at length. And I'm also particularly interested increasingly in carbon removals and work closely with Ingy Johnstone and Ben Caldecott, who kind of conceptualized carbon removal budgeting as well. And I'll pass it on to Lizzie.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, I am Lizzie Code, a Partner and Associate Director at Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, and I came into BCG specifically on the topic of carbon markets because I've worked quite extensively in it now, originally from Australia, where our universities look absolutely nothing like this, and have been previously working with country governments on like designing carbon markets, like emissions trading systems, on implementing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and then also looking at it from the voluntary market perspective, and working with all the different players along the value chain, because this is something where more and more it's become quite obvious that putting a price on carbon markets and driving growth and innovation through the voluntary market is really inevitable. We cannot get to net zero without sort of putting these prices on carbon, and with our current trajectory of emissions, we have very little chance of keeping temperatures in manageable zones without significant amounts of removals. So this is a topic that is, like, I think quite pivotal, and if you have been working in this market or interacted with this market, you'll also see that it's one that changes rapidly, has lots of different viewpoints, which makes it quite interesting and engaging and intellectually stimulating market as well. So I think you are in for a real treat for this one.
Thank you very much. My name is Antti Vihavainen. I am the co-founder and vice chairman of Puro Earth. We are a carbon removal focused standard and registry, which means that we basically define the methodologies or the requirements that define the characteristics of carbon net negative activities. We do that together with our advisory board, who is, by the way, led by or chaired by Miles Allen, the professor from University of Oxford, and together with the practitioners and scientists around the world. Once those methodologies are in place, suppliers or aspiring suppliers of negative emissions reach out to us and they claim that they have fulfilled the requirements. And to be sure that that is the case, we send out an auditor to the site, checking it out, making sure that the evidence checks out. Then with the report coming into us, we issue credits or CO2 removal certificates, or CORCs, into the registry that we manage, that then ensures the integrity of the life cycle of the credit, which is then bought by companies like BCG, for example. Yeah, that's it. That's basically me.
Thanks so much. I guess I'll start off with some overarching kind of comments, and then we'll get into two presentations. Then we'll do a bit of Q&A between the audience. And one feedback that I've gotten from people who have attended other events is we'd like to have more Q&A time as well. So I'm going to reserve 30 minutes for you guys to speak, give little speeches as well, give little questions as well. So we'll try to keep it interactive at the end as well, okay? So today, global emissions are about 40 billion tons a year, right? We all know that there is a carbon budget of about 250 to 300 billion tons. If we keep on at the rate at which we are emitting carbon, we're going to burn through that carbon budget within 7 years, right? We need to obviously try to reach net zero by 2050 in order to meet the 1.5 degrees target. This implies, according to the IEA, that we need to reduce our carbon emissions by 2030 by about 40% from 2019 levels. 2019 levels. Of which 40%, that actually roughly translates into about 17 billion tons carbon emissions. And the IEA also says that a lot of that emission reductions can come from renewable energy capacity, energy efficiency, better, greener industrial practices and so forth. But it's going to be that hard to abate sectors, the sectors which are really, really tough to address. And that's where carbon removal technologies or offsets potentially come in as a last resort. And as I was doing a bit of my education, as I mentioned to some of the audience participants earlier today, I like this analogy about how hospitals need to have a certain number of beds in the ICU to deal with those emergency cases, right? But you don't want anybody who just comes in with a sort of a scratch to take on that capacity as well. So that's how I sort of think about it with respect to carbon removals as being the option of last resort, but a crucial toolkit as part of how we deal with rising emissions. With that being said, there are two kinds of emissions. There are two kinds of emissions removal technologies. Obviously, there are ones which are based on nature, and there are ones based which are man-made. And on this topic, I think I'll hand it off to Antti, who's going to talk about how we ensure that such human perceived or created remove technologies are well integrated. So too.
Thank you very much. I'll start with a white slide. So with the sort of conversations that I've had, with everybody today or yesterday, I've sort of realized that it's good to start from the basics, not underestimating your intelligence, but just to make sure that we are sort of understanding this topic in a same manner. What I'm going to talk about is sort of carbon removal indeed, which is the last resort. It is something that, however, cannot be done last. So it is. So it can't be done the latest. We need to start working on it today. It is not something that would replace or somehow sort of make emission reductions redundant. Quite the contrary. Even if we do our utmost in emission reductions, there's a lot to be done within the removals. So I'm sort of basing the examples on the sort of massively radical emission reductions that should be successful. And if we are not successful, then we have to do more on carbon removal side. So I thought that I'd start the presentation by sort of attaching this concept to something that I believe many of you are familiar, which is the EU taxonomy, which is basically dividing activities into two categories. You have non-eligible activities that are sort of generating power with coal combustion, and then eligible activities that are sort of, for example, solar power generation or doing fossil generation, but attaching a CCS or carbon capture and storage equipment to that. And we are used to thinking that the non-eligible ones are not good, and the ones that are eligible are good. I think we all agree on these matters. Now, with this in force, we have resulted in this. Who knows what this is? Anybody? No, this is not. Yes. CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, exactly, the so-called Keeling curve. So this is what has happened in reality in the atmosphere. This is the, this is causing the temperature rise. This is all that matters, basically. All right. So when I was born in 1972, the carbon content in the atmosphere was 1,500 gigatons. Now it's 2,000 gigatons, roughly. A lot of CO2 has been emitted in the atmosphere in the past 50 years, and we can see that it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. Let's zoom in a little bit. We all remember the pandemic and how the whole world halted. And we can see that the emissions actually did decrease for a moment. But what did it do to the concentration? Not much. So it delayed the rise of the CO2 concentration by a month. It's not much, no. So we need to do a little bit more. So the blue one, the red one is the actual measurements, and the black one is sort of season-adjusted line there. And as we all know, like I said, this is the highest concentration ever, and it's also the warmest ever. There's a high correlation in that. All right. So what do we need to do? I'm sort of suggesting, and I'm borrowing this from a gentleman in the front row. He told me yesterday a wise thing, that we are actually trying to treat a stock problem with flow. So there's too much in the stock. How do we sort of treat that problem with, reducing the flow into that stock? Well, that doesn't really work, does it? So I'm proposing that we add a new category in our thinking. It's not just me, it's plenty of others as well. We have these two categories. So let's add another one. There are positive activities that are actively drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They are, for example, direct air capture with storage, taking CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it underground. And I'm also proposing that we would sort of relabel these in our thinking. We should instead think about bad activities and less bad activities, and then good activities. Stuff that, we know that, we need to generate power, and we should do that in, the least bad ways possible, right? Everything still causes emissions. The production of power, photovoltaic panels creates emissions. Deploying them causes emissions, but it's really good in that sense. Okay. So, in theory, on a highest possible level, carbon removal means that you capture CO2, which is basically quite trivial. You plant a tree, or you throw money at a direct air capture facility. That works well. Then you have to do something to stabilize the CO2. Then you need to store it permanently. All of that then equals carbon removal. With the caveat that, of course, the captured CO2 has to originate from the atmosphere, or it has to be biogenic, which means that the plants have captured it from the atmosphere. And the stabilization phase can also be replaced with transportation. So taking CO2 from let's say a bioenergy power plant to an injection site, that could be take the same role in this equation. And storage, that should take place in a geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or even in products in some cases. So this is the theory. This is the sort of the highest level theory of carbon removal. What does it mean in practice? Well, these are some examples of methodologies that we have implemented thus far. And we've given them sort of contracted permanence, or we've sort of categorized them in contracted permanence baskets. As you can see, all of them are more than 100 years in permanence. Terrestrial storage of biomass is just starting to pick up. Biochar is by far the most popular in terms of number of suppliers that are working on it. There are, out of the 350 companies that are being certified by us, or are in the process of being certified by us, more than half of them are biochar-based companies. Geologically stored carbon is our way of talking about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture. which, yeah, so we are, for example, certifying Climeworks. Many people here probably have heard of Climeworks, so we are the ones certifying and issuing the credits to Climeworks. Carbonated materials, basically mineralizing CO2 into substances like concrete. And enhanced rock weathering is a very promising methodology where the natural sort of weathering ability of certain minerals is utilized. It creates bicarbonates and stores CO2 in the soil for thousands of, for millennia. And we are now we have started to work on marine CDR methodologies, and those are progressing nicely. There's actually 3 of them due out during this year. So lots of exciting new opportunities there. Okay, so we've been at it for 6 years now, a little bit more. So we started in May 2019, our commercial operations. Here's an anecdote. Starting from zero is hard. So generating actual new industries by giving them an incentive to build their businesses on takes a lot of time. So it took us 5 years to get to 500,000, so first half a megaton. Then after that, it took us approximately 9 months to get to the next the first full megaton. And now it's going to take us approximately 13 months to get to the next full megaton. So quite a nice acceleration here. So megaton sounds nice, doesn't it? It's almost the same as gigaton, right? All right, so I'm glad that you are laughing. It seems that somebody is awake and understands math a little bit. So let's take a moment and look at the math over here. Everybody agrees that we need to develop capacity of 5 to 10 gigatons of removals by 2050. Let's say 6, for example. Let's aim for 6. That means that there is actually, if in terms of number of working days between today and 2050, there's approximately 6,120 working days. How many millions of tons are there in 6 gigatons? Right, 6,000. So what we need is every working day, starting tomorrow, to develop a new capacity of everything that we've issued in 6 years in order to hit this 6 gigaton capacity by 2050. So my question to you is, who takes tomorrow's turn? That's it. That concludes my presentation. You're good?
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. A round of applause for that. Thank you. Thank you. I am going to do my presentation sitting down. I hope that's okay with you. I just really like the security of having my nose over here. I have the joyful task of introducing to you the carbon removal budget, which is the headline concept for this panel. And this is based on a paper that is written by Ben Caldecott and Angie Johnstone that I just mentioned at the beginning. You can find that, it's open access, and I urge you all to read it. It's a brilliant paper, and I know I'm not just biased. So how did this concept come about? It came about in a threefold way. So first, as was already explained by both Antti and Calvin, we do already know that there is a need for us to reach net zero, and carbon removals are a crucial way in which we will reach net zero. Under every single model and scenario under the IPCC 6th assessment, carbon removals have been set out as unavoidable and necessary to provide that net to net zero. So what carbon removals do in essence is they help address all the residual emissions. So all those emissions that are unabatable and they cannot be easily reduced, specifically by hard to abate sectors, right? Second, and also carbon removals are very important to then clean up the legacy carbon that is going to still remain in the atmosphere, even at the global net zero date, even if we reach that target, which is, yeah, not looking quite promising at the moment. The second piece of background for this is that we already have existing carbon removal techniques. And the science and technology is developing, and Ante did a fantastic job in setting that out for you. And all of these different techniques range from conventional methods, so land-based methods, to more technological novel methods. They differ in technology, they differ in the resources needed to produce them, and of course, they differ in the price points in which they are procured. And thirdly, we have already developed budgeting approaches. You might already be familiar with carbon budgets. Can I see a show of hands if anyone has heard that term before? Yeah, most of you. Great. And those budgets principally recognize kind of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and the principle of equity, right? That different states and different entities have different responsibilities and capacities to get us to the point of net zero. And that is at the core of carbon budgets. However, these carbon budgets do not necessarily address removals, and they should. Countries and entities also have different responsibilities to scale and use carbon removal, and equally, they have different capacities to do so. For example, the scaling of land-based removals requires vast tracts of land. That of technological removals typically requires considerable energy consumption. And these are often points of criticism that are brought against removals, right? That sometimes maybe the scaling of removals might not be compatible to sustainable development goals. And we're very open to having those discussions and debates today. But also removals remain like a very poorly understood resource, and we are just at the beginning. We are just scratching the surface of removals and developing them. And carbon removals are a finite rather than an infinite resource. This is also another point of criticism that we can talk about. So unlike emission reductions, CDR is constrained by technical, by economic, and by environmental limits. And as such, it needs to be effectively and equitably allocated. And treating CDR as a finite resource places attention at the very hard work that is needed to scale it. And to give you an estimate of this, the State of CDR report, which is developed by Steve Smith at the University of Oxford, that is also a brilliant open access resource that I urge you all to read, it estimates that we need to scale removals by 1,300 times by 2050 in order to reach net zero, and that is like a large sum. So this was kind of the foundation on which the concept of a carbon removal budget was built. And a carbon removal budget is a conceptual tool that allows us to estimate, to allocate, and to manage finite CDR in a just and equitable way. And the way that the CRB is defined, we have a little equation there as well, is a cumulative amount of carbon dioxide removal available to contribute to the realization of global temperature goals. And the way that this works, oh, sorry, that was the wrong slide. But okay. So a CRB can be applied from at the level of both countries, organizations, and also other financial actors. And CRBs offer a forward-looking planning tool to evaluate the feasibility of net zero target. So if you're a country, if you're a government, you can implement your own CRB. If you're an entity, a company, you can do that. If you're a region, you can also do that. And you can use that equation as well. And the way that you estimate CRBs is essentially you compare kind of a top-down assessment of CDR demand via IPCC Paris-aligned scenarios, and also you compare this with kind of bottom-up estimates of accessible CDR supply. And we can also talk about how that looks like in practice. These are the 3 carbon removal budget scenarios in the IPCC 6th assessment report. So in the first scenario, you see an annual CRB deficit. So this can be the case in which you have more demand than available supply, right? And you only have mostly conventional CDR. This is being supplied, so land-based CDR. The second is a neutral one. So in this scenario, you would have a mix of conventional and novel methods, and then it would be kind of the demand and the supply side would be more or less aligned. And then you have the third scenario, which is probably ideal, is the annual CRB surplus. And this would be ideal because, as I said, even at the global net zero target date, we will still have some legacy carbon left over in the atmosphere that might contribute to future warming, and that removals are kind of the only technology that we know of now that can solve that and contribute then to drawdown. But very crucially, under all Paris-aligned pathways, there is likely to be a global CRB deficit between now and 2100, which is not very promising statistics. So I'm not going to do that. So yeah, just to simply wrap up, we need to scale CDR, and we need to scale it now. And CRBs can be a crucial tool in which they can allow us to do this, and to do this in a way that is just, in a way that is equitable, and in a way that brings about, you know, things like it meets the promise of common but differentiated responsibilities. It meets those principles of equity, and we're not just scaling CDR just for the sake of scaling CDR, but we are doing that in a way that is globally just and benefits both the global north and the global south. So we can do that sustainably, we can do that equally, and I think having all of you in this room and all the brilliant minds in this room come together and speak about these issues and deal with all the criticisms that removals get, I think it's very, very, very important. So I hope we have some interesting discussions, and I'll pass it on to Calvin now. Oh, and just one thing, because I was told to say this. Please join us if you want to know more about the Oxford carbon removal budget. Please join us at the symposium at the end of the month. It is hosted on the 31st of July. This is a QR code. You can register. And we look forward to seeing you there. And we will get more into the weeds of this topic. And for all of you who are a little bit of nerds about carbon removal as we are, we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cindy. You know, when I read up on this topic as well, again, my education the last 2 days, the other analogy that I thought about was with vaccines, basically. We all remember what happened during the COVID situation and how it was a mad scramble for vaccines in that first 6 months. And I was at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's an infrastructure bank. And then we were called to take part in vaccine financing. And we had to do the vaccine financing through a program called COVAX. So essentially, the World Health Organization came together and tried to find a way to equitably allocate vaccines to countries. So I think this work that Ben and Inji is actually it's a great contribution to the idea that we need to think about how do we allocate carbon removable technologies to certain countries? How do we also avoid some of the incentives for companies or countries to grab on to those carbon removable budgets, save it, and then reduce the incentives for themselves to decarbonize, because they're very expensive, right? I think DAC, direct air capture, is about $700 per ton at this point in time, right? Compared to a carbon price of you know what. So anyways, I'd like to now hand it off to Lizzie. Do you have any reflections and comments you want to add? And then maybe I can re-ask the people for questions.
Hopefully this works. Does it? Can you still? Okay, perfect. So just a couple of comments and reflections there in terms of what it means for then, like how the actual market is being driven forwards at the moment. And most of the carbon removal market is actually being driven by a select number of corporate buyers who are buying the removals credits that are coming out. And this volume is still currently relatively small. BCG is actually consistently in the top 10. Microsoft is often a 10-fold bigger buyer than the next biggest one after it. So it is a really small group of corporates who are driving this forwards. And that often they are looking at and setting their budget in terms of the number of tons they need to buy based on the emissions that they are putting out. So they were trying to cancel out their own emissions so that then they're not having this sort of, they're not adding to the stock of carbon that's in the atmosphere. And the other part of the budget that's important for these buyers is the actual monetary budget that they're going to be using for that. And I'll come on to that in a second. But in terms of what we're also seeing in the market is we're actually seeing more and more governments jumping on board looking at the carbon removals because they're recognising how necessary it is going to be because we are very much on track to overshoot emissions. And so they're really looking at, and we're seeing this particularly in Europe, the UK. We were seeing this in the US, that's obviously changed a lot now. We're also seeing it in Japan, a little bit in Singapore and other parts of the world as well, where governments, so UK has set a target for how many engineered removals, so this is looking at the things like the direct air carbon capture and generating energy with carbon capture attached to that, which often referred to as something like BECCS or something, or energy from waste with carbon capture. So the UK government has set a target for how many removals they want. And there's other countries in Europe who have done studies to figure out how many removals might be the equitable fair share that they might need into the future. And sometimes that range, for example, for Germany, I believe that range is between 70 and 150 because they do not know what their emissions are going to be between now and 2050 realistically. So we are seeing a lot of variety there. And then in terms of how corporates are setting the financial budgets, one thing we're seeing increasingly, and something that I've actually written along with Inji from Oxford and Patch, who sell removals carbon credits, as well as other carbon credits, a paper on best practice principles for internal carbon pricing. And that's something where it's a tool for corporates to be able to, and any organisation actually, just talking about it from the corporate perspective, any organisation to be able to implement within their organisations that's going to help first drive down their own emissions, which is obviously as the sort of first thing that's happening in the mitigation hierarchy, but then also if it comes with, if this internal carbon price within the organisation, if that is not just a sort of hypothetical line item in a budget, but actually needs to be paid into some sort of fund within the organisation, then that can actually create the financial budget within organisations for them to be able to buy those carbon credits. So again, something that's none of this is the only solution, but is a possible helpful tool and solution in the arsenal that's out there and available. And that'll be coming out very soon.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. I'd like to open it up now to questions from the audience. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I have a few questions, actually, and observations on the concept itself. I mean, there's a lot of merits in this concept, of course. The fact that it recognizes carbon removals as an essential tool is of course good. I'm a little hesitant on this sort of top-down sort of concept of allocating you know, the finite capacity to certain entities, be it organizations or countries or you know, regional entities, because usually sort of these allocation systems don't necessarily end up in the most efficient way of doing things, and we've only got one climate, so it doesn't really matter who does and where it takes place, because it all affects the same climate. Is that a fair comment?
No, that is a very fair comment, but I think, oh, sorry. That is a very fair comment, but I think at the heart of carbon removal budget, as I kept reiterating as well, is not just about the efficiency aspect of it, right? It's about kind of the justice and equity aspect of it. And as I did say, like, countries have different responsibilities and different capacities to scale carbon removals, and so do entities and corporate entities. And I think having a carbon budget, which can be also quite compatible and aligned, a carbon removal budget, excuse me, which can be aligned with a carbon budget as well, that can be very helpful in that regard to also look at the systemic injustices when we are doing climate action of any sort.
Okay. Thank you. Another observation, which is related to the finite nature of carbon removals, as is supposed or sort of assumed in this study. I actually respectfully, and for sake of argument, challenge that. So from the position where we are as an organization, we're bombarded by innovation every day. So there are sort of entrepreneurs that are seeing, and scientists that are seeing an opportunity to develop something new that avoids the pitfalls of activities that have been off limits. So our advisory board, led by Marcellen, has told us not to go to areas where the potential environmental hazards are difficult to contain, difficult to assess in beforehand or difficult to contain. That means that we've typically operated only in sort of closed systems or semi-closed systems where we can actually, quantification can take place via measuring. However, when we've communicated that to the, the ecosystem around us, they've said, okay, all right, we'll figure out a way to do what was previously an open system in a reactor. So suddenly massive opportunities open up in areas where they didn't exist in our minds before. I've actually told several potential suppliers, don't waste your time with us. We don't go there. And then they come back and say, all right, there's a new version. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, and this is a joke. No, yes, it is finite to the extent that when we run out of CO2 in the atmosphere, but not much before that. There's a lot of potential, so not just the geologic removal, but the marine CDR is a huge opportunity. Once we learn about those mechanisms, there's a lot of sea area in the planet, and the mechanisms there. During the next decades, when we actually put our heads around this topic, we'll learn so much more, and the massive quantities that can be achieved over there are possible. There are, of course, dangers, and we want to sort of be conscious of not just saying that keep on polluting. That's not the point. Each one of these processes are going to remain rather expensive. So that is the limit, in our opinion. So there's an economic limit, and every CFO, every investor should, of course, always look at the marginal abatement cost. If the marginal abatement cost reducing emissions is lower than buying removals, then of course one should rather reduce their emissions. That's first and foremost priority. So I'd say that even if this model works, the concept works, the budgeting concept works, even if you remove the limitation on the available quantity, in my opinion. It works, just start talking.
I will keep the answer brief because I really want the audience to also get a chance to participate in Q&A. But it's not just about quantity, is it? It's about quality as well.
Sure.
And at the moment, there is a lot of methodological uncertainty for a lot of removals. I mean, a lot of studies have shown that there is a patchwork of MRVs, for example, that are not consistent for a lot of these technologies. And I am an advocate of them, and I do understand the importance of scaling them, as I've frequently mentioned as well. But we also need to ensure that what we are scaling is of high quality, that it doesn't bring more social and environmental harm than it is necessary. And a lot of these technologies, even land-based removals, for example, might bring about this sort of environmental and social harm. So I think in order to do that, yes, there are finite limits to how much we can scale good quality CDR projects, right? And there's also political constraints, economical constraints, technological constraints as well. To some point, yes, sure, the science is advancing and innovation is ripe, I'm here for it. But these constraints do exist, and unless we face these constraints, then we do not come to a very realistic assessment of, okay, we need to scale this within some specific parameters, and we need to scale them now. So it takes away from the urgency of the task that we have before us if we think there's an infinite capacity for us to develop the CDR needed, which might lead to kind of then deterrence and not willingness to participate in this innovation in the first place.
Well, I mean, the urgency should be clear for all of us when looking at the math that I presented over there. So even if, you know, we are sort of, even if it was sort of, you know, infinite or sort of limitless or the boundaries were really high, it just takes a lot of work. Lots of capital needs to be deployed, and it has to be distributed among the humankind to an extent that, you know, not many activities are in order to reach that sort of scaling. So there's, in my opinion, no danger of diluting that urgency, even if we sort of loosen up a little bit on the limitations, because high-quality removals can happen in vast numbers. Just to sort of the, you know, there are people who have sort of estimated the geologic carbon removal storage capacity. And of course, you know, it is logical that, you know, most of the CO2 that we have now, the excess CO2 that we have in the atmosphere is from a, you know, from below the Earth's crust. So that means that there's probably room for, you know, CO2 in the same place where it originally came from. So there's a lot of opportunities. It just costs a lot. It takes a lot of concerted effort. And, you know, if this sort of a budgeting approach helps us, you know, communicate the urgency and deploy the cash, yes, then let's go for it.
I was just going to say, I think overshooting our carbon removals budget is probably not a concern that we have to worry about.
Yeah, exactly, that's right.
It would be a nice problem to have.
And the thing is, we need to then, of course, start reducing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So, you know, leaving it to wherever it ends up, 400, 500, you know, 550, you know, is the least it will end up going to. And that's, you know, we need to take it down from there. So we need to enter into a carbon net negative world. We need to continue to do that, you know, after 2050 as well.
Okay. I'll jump here and then over to you.
Thank you all. This was great and interesting discussion, but what pains me is to see how we have always said history repeats itself. But it's very interesting to see the same errors which we have committed historically, and I was watching the last session and this one too, the same errors get repeated, and we don't seem to learn in climate from what the world did 25 years ago. If we look at carbon markets, why does, I think Antti was making that point, why do they fail? Why do voluntary carbon markets are shrinking? Because if I'm at a higher emission and you're at lower emission, I have incentives to improve. And therefore, the demand comes down and there will be no asset. So there is no carbon asset which can ever get created. So very clearly, we stay out of the taxation because of political reasons. And very simplistically, we want markets to solve the same problem which are called market failures. If it is an externality and it is a market failure, and we want to create a market to solve the problem where markets are not working. So the world has learned these lessons 25 years ago. We have seen this happen in infrastructure, we have seen this happen in roads, we have seen this happen, and we come back and repeat that again. I have one question for you, Antti. Notwithstanding the fact, and it's very clear that we are trying to address, which you repeated, the flow versus the stock problem. Yeah, I do agree with the fact that a budget is a word that is to be used where there is a finite constraint of resource allocation. Here, you are creating a situation where you are extracting emitted carbon, and even the net zero concept tells you that there will be residual emissions remaining, and we all know the curves are not going to bend in whichever way in the time frame. But the question for you as a registry is, are you totally dependent on saying, will the markets be solving this problem? I look at it slightly differently because there is a need for CDR undoubtedly. There's no question, and thanks for the explanation of removing or clarifying the confusion between mitigation and removal, which is the 90% of the confusion I also see around. Now, if this were to be a public good, would you think there should be state public investments happening in it? And that is where public investments can get, and I do agree with you on the limitations of geography. You can have advanced rock weathering, basalt layers in India has a huge amount, UK has, maybe other countries have, those limitations may be there. But economic activity will continue to create emissions because, and that makes me align with you in saying, yeah, till we are producing, we are burning something, because till we are burning something to produce energy, we'll still have carbon, because the only question you have is whether you burn hydrocarbon or burn hydrogen. Till the point you're able to burn hydrogen and produce water, you will continue to burn hydrocarbons. And therefore the question is, will markets solve it? Will it be a public issue? And the last technical question is, why isn't photosynthesis becoming one of the artificial carbon removals?
It is. Biochar is based on photosynthesis, so that's definitely included. It's the most efficient way of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. The answer to whether markets are going to solve this, no, not the voluntary carbon markets, no. We are not going to get to the required levels with voluntary carbon markets. However, compliance markets get us, much further to, I would say, a gigaton level at least. Yeah, how much further than that, I don't know. We have a bit of a challenge with some of the large markets. China is picking up. China is doing stuff that we didn't see it sort of at least talking about a year ago. So that's really interesting to see where they are going. So let's see.
I think also, I've heard this a lot of this kind of the government's role versus the voluntary role. And I think every single person who works in the climate space can very much agree it would be absolutely fantastic if every government in the world would regulate and either, like even if they put a cap on emissions, they put a compliance price like an ETS or a carbon tax or something, that would be the dream. We are nowhere near that. We are so far from that. It takes a really long time. And so I think we can all agree it would be great if every single government in the world did that. That is not the world we live in. What else can we do that would be helpful? And that's where the voluntary market comes in. So no one is saying the voluntary market is better. No one is saying we should do removals and not reduce emissions. It is really about, this problem is complex. It is at a kind of scale that I don't think any of us can really fathom. And therefore we need every single solution coming all at once and creating complexity in the market, unfortunately. But if we don't try and do that, then we'll just get further and further behind from where we currently are. And it has sort of proven to be a bit correct so far. As I was saying, there's all of these voluntary buyers who are the reason that there has been investment and innovation in carbon removals technology. That is almost exclusively driven by about 10 to 20 corporates who have driven a lot of buying in this market over the last 6 or so years. And now we're seeing all these country governments are saying, okay, well, let's incorporate 5 or 10% of our allowances. Let's look at how we can incorporate CDR into there, and it'll scale up over time. And the UK has an actual proposal on the table. The EU is coming out with their proposal in July next year. So we're looking at sort of the 2030s, what the voluntary market has triggered off, making it into compliance markets, and hopefully that sort of, scaling up and stepping forwards, because a bit of innovation, proof of concept can happen, and that it's sort of driven by this commercial lens, which helps with efficiency, and then governments can take it on board and hopefully take it to the kind of scale that we're going to need to see.
I'm just going to add one more sentence to that. So we don't only have voluntary markets and compliance markets. We also have this, what we call quasi-compliance international markets in between, right? So the Article 6 frameworks provide some of these kind of a bit more flexible, but quasi-compliance markets. And we are hoping to see kind of an integration of more and more removals within these types of markets. And at Oxford, we just released a policy brief as well on envisioning how a net zero aligned Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, so under Article 6.2 would look like, if it only encompassed specifically technological removals as well as a framework and as a tool to scale up these technologies in the future.
Yeah, no, it's a great discussion. I come from an investor network, so we work mainly with mainstream investors, and there is a lot of interest in this carbon removal space, but also a bit of confusion, right? I think, so they have listed assets, in listed space. I mean, obviously, SBTI came up with how, these can be used, and then obviously then they changed the goalpost a bit. So I think in terms of the demand and where you see the split between how much the demand for carbon removals, based on these voluntary standards and other frameworks and so on. You touched upon the CDM and, all the national markets and stuff, the compliance markets. But on the voluntary side, I mean, how are these standards going to set the goalposts for like how much carbon removals can be part of a corporate inventory, let's say? How much can they use in their net zero commitments and claims? I think it'd be good to have clarity on that. And also, I guess, in terms of the equity side, right? I think, obviously, you talked about the DAC and the biogenic removals and so on. I think we work in the agri-food space, and how is that split going to work? I mean, is it going to be a bunch of technological removals? Is that the way forward? Or how is that split going to look like, right? Because from land grabbing perspective and in the global south, I mean, is going to be a bunch of companies setting up like technological removals, or are they going to work with these landowners or sort of conservation projects or whatever, to remove carbon? So I think there is a lot of these issues that is still left on the table, and we know the epic failure of the carbon credits side. And now we're having these conversations. So how do we provide the clarity required for mainstream investors to get into the space, given all of these complexities?
I actually have lots of calls with investors who are basically asking similar questions of trying to just navigate this market. It is quite complex. It is a real challenge, and it does evolve really quickly. And the other thing that we find is there's always hints of how it's going to change, and then it takes at least sort of 18 months to kind of see that through. And in that time, no one has a definite answer. So for example, many of you will know that SBTI came up with an updated draft. So I think that was 6 to 12 months later than was expected, and now it's out for consultation, which means they haven't landed in a final spot. And so we're still looking at, potentially 2026 by the time those rules are defined, which is quite a long period and makes a difference because there's, I think it's 6,000 or 7,000 companies have signed up for SBTI. So we're talking quite a lot of pretty significantly sized companies that this is going to affect. And then you see that on the compliance side with the removals coming into emissions trading system and that sort of stuff. And unfortunately, there's the way the market is now and the speed that it is evolving, it has not started to become less fragmented or less complex. We're not quite seeing at the moment either like aligning of different voluntary standards or compliance standards. We're not seeing that alignment between different countries. We're not seeing that alignment between the voluntary and compliance. There's different groups that would like to work more and more to alignment, but ultimately we haven't even seen that. So we don't even have alignment between the EU and the UK. And the UK announced a couple of months ago that they're going to link back up for their compliance market, which means they'll need to link back up for their removals in the compliance market. And they started as the same market and then separated with Brexit. So even there, with all of those factors, there's still like different fragmentation and complexity. So unfortunately, over the next few years, it's not going to get better, which requires either expert guidance or like participation and keeping up to date in that market, because it's also, there's lots of people who talk within the market and all these kind of conversations. So generally, as the direction of travel gets narrowed down for, say, SBTI, most people in the market will generally know how that's kind of moving over time, just because it's a small market where everyone kind of knows each other and that kind of stuff. So, and that has been the only way that people have been able to jump in and navigate it. What we've also seen is, particularly on the investor side, they look at investing in specific pockets of the market. So they become experts at DAC or experts at energy from waste with CCS. And so instead of trying to understand every dynamic and every conversation and everything going on, it is what is the ones where you're in, and then obviously the classic one of where there's lower risk because there's more demand ultimately, which is moving more and more towards the engineered removals end of the spectrum, because a lot of the kind of problems with CDM and some of the previous rounds of carbon markets, lots of them have been improved upon, but there's still, just because it's this complex, fragmented and voluntary, which means there's no one organisation setting the rules and everyone has to follow it, you end up with having to look really deeply into some of those areas, and you're finding a bit less of that on the engineered removal space, because it sort of started from a newer point and started from a higher point, I think, and that's part of the reason as well. It hasn't got as much of the baggage that's associated with some of the other areas. But that is, and I think this was talked about before, but it's where a lot of people are therefore perceiving, engineered removals are therefore high quality, and say a nature-based removal is therefore bad quality. But that is not actually the case. You can get really high quality in nature-based removals that are supporting the local communities. There's really good social safeguards. It's just that you have to look a lot more detail, spend a lot more time, and that makes it, that demand signal is therefore not as clear.
There are sort of market structures that are trying to help that. Of course, we, the standards, need to do our job in sort of ensuring the quality of the credits that are issued in the first place. There are organizations that are trying to keep us honest, like ICBC, MCCP, or Corsia, or others. They are doing a really good job on the, let's say, the governance side, but they are not really looking into what goes into the credit. And that's a shame, because if they don't differentiate between the different types of activities, be it an emission avoidance or removal, then the use of the credits should, you can't really claim to be in net zero or neutralize your emissions, unless you're using removals. And that differentiation is necessary and should be done. That would help, separate two different purposes. Both are useful, but just for different purposes. So meta standards are useful. Unfortunately, there are several of them, which is again sort of fragmenting the market slightly. There are countries like Singapore, for example, that makes use of Corsia as an sort of an proxy for quality, which makes sense. Therefore, for example, we've decided to apply for Corsia approval, and but unfortunately these local markets do increase fragmentation. That is indeed true, and we'll see a sort of a phase of divergence before we see a new sort of convergence in this sector.
And the G7 have recently come out with a thing of they're trying to get interoperability between markets, partly driven as well by CBAM in Europe. And then there's specifically the UK, Kenya and Singapore are also currently started up an initiative and launched an initiative of also trying to drive this harmonisation.
Hello. Very interesting discussion, and Antti and I had a discussion over lunch as well. So just a bit of background. Karel van Randwyk. I teach sustainable finance to corporate treasurers and as part of the Association of Corporate Treasurers Sustainable Finance course, and part of that course covers carbon markets. And for corporates, it's a real issue if they are looking to buy carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets. It's how to treat them for accounting purposes. I'm an accountant as well. So are they an asset? Are they contingent liability? Do they hit the P&L straight away as soon as they pay for them? If you're looking to buy 10 years worth of carbon credits, you can't afford to take that hit to the P&L day one. So are you aware of any work that's being done to standardize the accounting treatment of carbon credits for corporates?
Do you want to take a stab at it?
So the accounting in terms of the carbon accounting is where all of the focus has been on, not the accounting in terms of the financial aspect of it. And so and the rules are still not 100% clear on the financial accounting because, you know, there's still the problem of worrying about double counting of the person who's produced the credit, the person who's purchasing the credit, and then also of the organisation that is purchasing the credit. Is it their scope 1 emissions, so they own it, and then is it someone else's supply chain scope 3 emissions? Even just the accounting around that is still kind of complex. When we get to the country level, Article 6 and corporates wondering if they have to fit into the country level accounting, and this is purely based on just counting the tons of carbon and who gets assigned the kind of legal responsibility for that tons of carbon. There's still a lot of debate about there. The financial side of it has still not been dived into. Generally, what I do see in corporates, though, is it's sitting with their corporate sustainability team. The annual budget or the 5-year budget that they're going to have to buy carbon credits obviously needs to be signed off from the finance team. And then it is purchased more like a consumable good. So it's expense, a line item expense. It is purchased as a consumable good, retired in the year that it needs to be retired in, and then doesn't sit within assets or liabilities within the company. And that's because most corporates are buying them to retire them. When you're looking at in a trading house, that is when, which like the financial institutions, the trading houses, that's when it starts getting a lot more, like a lot bigger questions about how to deal with it and how they're going to treat it. And I think that has shifted a bit over time as well, because originally they were seen as assets to be able to trade and make money off. However, now there's a greater realisation of some of the risks that comes with them, and that in some of the earlier contracts, and even some of the contracts now, not all of the ownership and risk ownership is clearly identified and assigned, which means there could be much bigger liabilities sitting with some of those carbon credits, especially some of the older ones, than people realise. So, in summary, there's not a great answer.
Well, there's perhaps, so I fully agree. This is exactly the standard way of doing it. However, there are a couple of examples within our ecosystem. For example, British Airways bought credits in advance in a long-term offtake agreement, and they had, in a way, 2 intermediaries there. One that makes the portfolio of the credits, and the other one that finances that deal. Standard Chartered is the financing organization over there. So in a way, there's a liability for British Airways to, there's a future cost to them, but nothing left their bank account. And the supplier still got their money in advance, of course with a cost, taken by the bank. But still, probably those sorts of structures are becoming sort of more prevalent. Of course, that requires that the buyer is, of high credit rating. But at least for those, those sorts of mechanisms are available.
And just one final thing to add to that. I think it's also important to understand that the legal nature of carbon credits also differs between different types of jurisdictions, right? The way that Indonesia will treat carbon credit and defines it under its finance directive, I forget the name of the specific regulation, is much different to how it would be treated in the UK. So that legal nature is also different, and then might also influence and translate it into kind of this fragmented financial accounting as well. I think there was another hand behind you. If you could pass on the mic. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Alistair, a third-year PP student at Oxford. Got two questions. Firstly, so for context, I organised a clean tech speaker series for undergrads early in the year, and I had a few startups in. We had a week on carbon capture, and we had our two companies were a biological carbon capture company and a direct air carbon capture company, and we had a really nice kind of setup of the biological company saying we're the profitable guys, but we're small scale. Well, we're profitable. The other guy's saying, yeah, but you're a drop in the ocean. If you actually want to achieve carbon capture, it needs to be through engineered removals. So the first question is, do carbon capture companies need a sellable byproduct to be financially sustainable in the long run, especially at a time of jeopardized government support for policies? Admittedly, I'm not so clued up on the actual carbon markets. Still don't really make sense to me, but essentially, you know, like for example, this biological carbon capture company were using genetically modified algae to absorb carbon and produce sellable, like carbon compounds like supposedly insulin and vegan meat. And another company I've seen like use biochar to sell for agriculture, or sign gas as like a byproduct as well. So yeah, that's the first question. Do you need these sellable byproducts to be financially sustainable?
Well, it helps to get going. Biochar, of course, enjoys you know, four potential revenue streams in normal markets. First, you can, you know, in some markets, you can sell the physical biochar, you can sell the heat, you can sell the bio oil, and you can sell the carbon net negative attributes. So basically, it depends on the market how you allocate the cost of the production to all these elements. There's of course, you know, this, you know, the biological company that you mentioned sounds like, you know, a miracle in itself, and probably doesn't need the carbon markets to do what they do. It's still useful, even though it's not additional. So, you know, I don't think that we should somehow disregard you know, activities that survive without the help of carbon markets. That's wonderful, isn't it? You know, if the carbon removal becomes the byproduct, you know, then our challenge becomes a lot easier. Yeah, it helps. And if there are no other comments on that, the other question is, should we use the idea from the direct air carbon capture guy, some of you probably know, is we should use fossil fuels as the most efficient way to generate the heat that we need to capture carbon. What do you think? He said there's a 3-to-1 carbon atom economy, even accounting for gas pipeline leakages, but nobody's prepared to, it's too outlandish anybody to consider.
Generating the heat and electricity from fossil fuels, so let's say it's a gas-fired power station.
Yeah, it's not electricity, just heat.
Just heat for the carbon, for the DAX, you're saying. You then either have to be capturing, so it could still be burning gas, or burning tyres or something. You still need to be capturing that carbon. Otherwise, you're probably going to be emitting more carbon than you're capturing with the direct air capture.
He thought that was a 3-to-1 economy.
Yeah, so 1.5 does that. So 1.5 uses fossil to produce the energy. Check them out.
Okay.
I can put you in touch with them if you want as well.
Okay. Cool.
And it's basically that then, however you do the methodology, it has to match one of the methodologies set out by one of the standards organisations, and it basically accounts for any emissions you do throughout the process, which is like whether it's a power generated one or it's a heat generated one, and then you need to transport it to wherever it's going. So if you're close to a disused gas network and you can put it straight into pipes, the dream. Often that's not the case, which means you're then having to put it into maybe a truck or something, and then maybe even onto a ship if it's in Europe. And therefore you might need to compress the gas as well. And so all of these processes take either heat or energy or release emissions in some way, and that all gets accounted for in the methodology, which means your end thing that's coming out of that. So let's say you capture 100 tonnes of carbon, but in the process of capturing and storing that 100 tonnes, you emit 80 tonnes, you're only going to end up with 20 tonnes that you can sell as CDR removal certificates. And so therefore, you're going to need potentially a really high price for those 20 tonnes of removal certificates that you can actually sell. Or if you're getting some sort of product out of it, then you're going to need, a fair bit of that product plus maybe some of these certificates to be able to do it. Because ultimately, it's before any of these projects start, there's always financial modelling. There's always an assumption of what products they're going to get out of it to sell and how much price they're expecting for those products, and what removal certificates they're going to get out of it and how much price they're expecting for that removal certificate. And then they're saying, basically, is that enough to pay back the original CapEx investment and the ongoing OpEx of running that?
Yeah, and final follow-up, I mean, it's not a question. That biological carbon capture company, I met kind of intern for a VC a few weeks recently, and they mentioned this company. They said they can't make the byproducts as cheaply as the people who are not, they can't make, say, insulin as cheaply as the other people. So, whereas there's no, even they said there's no green premium. And then they also have issues with getting the quality of the organic compounds and stuff. So the technology is still, they are selling us a nice story at my talk, but still a long way to go, I think.
So we actually did there's a TED talk by someone who I work with. You should have a look at it. And I'm slightly forgetting his name right now, but it looks at basically if every product became sustainable, we did an analysis and it would be a 2 to 3% increase in costs, like green premium across all products. But that would rely on everyone implementing it. In reality, what we see is a lot more of it adds to the cost 10% or more. And we've done surveys and most consumers aren't willing to pay 10% more for a product, it's a really small amount, but most would pay 2 or 3%. And then there's even indices out there and that kind of stuff that show how much the green premium is on green steel and those sorts of things. There's actually some good information starting to emerge.
I have a quick question. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Hi, Andy Shaw from a company called Assimilar. We do work on peatland monitoring, extent and condition of peatlands. So I haven't heard peatlands mentioned. I guess they fall into the terrestrial natural carbon sink type part of the debate. What's the latest thinking on that? I've heard they're an obvious, the anecdote is if the UK restored all its degraded peatlands, we'd meet our net zero targets in one swoop. But I imagine the problem is the time it takes to capture the carbon within a natural process like that. So what is the thinking on peatlands as part of, and restoration of peatlands as part of the solution? And linked to that, the idea that carbon markets, that's obviously one financial solution, payment for ecosystem services, where we pay people whose systems are naturally capturing and storing carbon. Where does that fit in the range of options for getting finance flowing to people who manage natural ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I actually just did a project with the Welsh government, so this is quite fresh on my mind about peatland restoration and woodland creation. And as you might know, we have codes in the UK, so both the peatland and the woodland code, and those set specific quality standards, and they allow credits that are generated by woodland and peatland projects to be traded within the UK. So those projects that are developed within the UK, they are traded within the UK, creating a kind of very interesting domestic regulated voluntary market, which is being a common practice that is being adopted across a lot of global north countries recently. So we have that stream of finance into peatland restoration, right? Not necessarily as, finance for carbon removal, but just like for peatland restoration. Those are also included within the EU ETS, but increasingly all of the CCC reports, for example, are stating that there will be a finance gap in meeting the finance that is needed for the UK to reach its kind of carbon budget and to increase the scale of peatland restoration in the scale that it needs to, right? So they are looking increasingly at engaging with voluntary carbon markets, so the international voluntary carbon markets, in order to unlock that private finance that might be needed in order to scale this. But again, the concentration not so much in these types of projects as specifically removal projects, but just as, just peatland restoration and something that the UK needs to consider. But yeah, that's a good point.
Actually, I come from a country that is called Suomi. Suo in Finnish means swamp. So 1/3 of Finnish land or the surface area is swamp. And we've how do you call this? So we've messed up many of those swamps, trying to make them into tree fields. Now they have been drained, and massive amounts of CO2 have been emitted in that process. The peat has been extracted from there and it's been burned, and all of that stuff. Now, what I've understood from the University of Helsinki studies is that taking this sort of an ex-swamp or peatland and trying to restore that will cause excessive methane emissions for the next at least 100 years or even 300 years before it actually starts to become carbon net negative. So those systems are so tricky once they are messed up that we're not touching them. As methodologies because of those risks that you're trying to do the right thing, but you actually cause huge methane emissions.
Key to keep the ones that we already have.
Yeah, exactly.
Hello, I'm Chika Larasati from Climate Policy Initiative. So I'm very intrigued with the Puro Earth presentation about the good versus not good when you're categorizing the activities. So recently in Southeast Asia, we just introduced the term of the transition credits. So this is, there's a new methodology approved in May, basically saying that we can generate the credits by retiring the early coal-fired power plants. So I'm keen to know and hear your thoughts about how these transition credits will be accepted cross-border, because this term is actually recently introduced in Southeast Asia and also part of the pilot project of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and how this can be cross-border aligned, or when one of the panelists also mentioning the Paris Agreement Article 6.2, how this can be, how do you see this transition credit be accepted within the market in the future? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
I'm sorry to say, but I don't know. I don't know what does that credit represent. I've asked that from South Pole people that were involved in that process, and they couldn't explain to me what does it represent. So I cannot unfortunately comment on that. Do you know?
Yeah, similar. There's been initiatives out there, and obviously the financing just transition in the energy transition in the kind of countries that's been set up is really important. But there's also basically, well, actual rules around and methodologies, and then there's also quality criteria that are set for the voluntary carbon market. And at this stage, I just haven't seen a good explanation of how energy transition credits fit well within that. So it's like recognizing, yes, it definitely needs to be financed. These things definitely need to happen. But is carbon markets the best the best pathway for that. I haven't seen I just haven't seen much information on it, and I haven't seen the evidence on that yet.
Similarly on the question to transition credits, but just to think about different sources of financing, right? We need to be very careful, as Lizzie just mentioned, that voluntary carbon markets cannot be kind of the only source of finance that we think about a lot of these technologies. Like voluntary carbon markets, even markets that are created under the two market-based frameworks under the Paris Agreement, these should be used to finance high-hanging projects, additional projects, right? And we have other financing levers, even within the Paris Agreement itself, in order to finance some of these other types of activities, including like energy transition or activities under JETPs. So I think we need to be very critical when we look at the transition credits and the types and sources of finance and whether we should trade them into markets as well. But similarly, I also have no clarity on the specific question. But if I do, we will definitely reach out to you as well. Yeah. Do we have one more question?
Hi, Rebecca Sly from Regnan. We're an asset manager. I suppose, like, listening to all this is really interesting. I'm trying to put it in the context of a corporate, obviously, thinking from the investment lens. When they're looking at these projects, realistically, does it not come down to the kind of cost? So I suppose my first thought is, what is the price differential between these projects? What's the advantage for a corporate to invest in one of these more advanced technologies? And therefore, does that not mean that they're investing in, what I would assume to be lower cost, but therefore lower quality? A little bit going back to what you said, Cindy, around, I actually think it's good, and it's kind of a learning lesson from climate to realize the constraints earlier on and build that into a long-term strategy. I suppose I would have concerns that corporates are realistically going to take the cheapest option at this point, and then what happens? Whose responsibility is it to develop these kind of the technologies that might take us to 2050, for example? A few different questions in there. Thank you.
That's a very valid point. I'm of course, of the opinion that cheapest should sell first, just as long as it's sufficient quality. So that's why it's important to sort of set the quality criteria high, and then commoditize the credits to the extent that they are easy to buy for treasurers. That just want to get the best bang for the buck. So we don't want this sort of, unfortunately, the carbon markets or carbon removal market are still in this sort of a boutique kind of an shopping, phase where, you shop around and you make a sort of they are paid from the marketing budget, because you want to tell a nice story, and it somehow fits your sort of the lifestyle of your customers or the value chain that you represent or the color or whatever. So what we'd like to advocate for is to just focus on the climate impact, make that make the methodologies compete with each other for efficiency. Get rid of all the sort of superfluous, co-benefits that are sort of attributes that are trying to make the message a little bit more complex, and just focus on buying the cheapest portfolio.
But then I think you'd be faced with, if you were just going to buy the cheapest, you would never buy any of the engineered removals because they're astronomically higher than the other ones. Like, coming from a corporate who does buy a lot of these, like, we want to be climate leaders. I think we are as well. But that's why we go into this, because it's important to bring in like the best staff. It's important when we're talking with our clients and that sort of stuff. So we see it as a core part of the work we do and who we are as a company, that we are leaders in climate and sustainability. We also fundamentally believe that carbon markets are a really impactful thing for the planet, and that therefore this is a kind of something to follow. And generally the corporates that are buying a lot of these credits are somewhere along that sort of spectrum, and some of them also really want to, like, they are Silicon Valley, very innovative companies, and they're really wanting to get into these novel, innovative technologies as well. And so they're they're looking at factors that are beyond just how many tons am I buying today, and they're thinking about how can we make a market in the future how can we still maximize impact, but longer term impact, because investing in these projects now is critical to be able to have, fund them and scale up, like the speed of the scale up that we've seen. And so it really is, what can we do now within these constraints of, we've made commitments around how much we're going to offset of our residual emissions. We've obviously done heaps and heaps on actually reducing our emissions. And then we also have a financial budget as well. So these are constraints around what we purchase. And then it is a little bit more art than science, balancing that portfolio, because also a lot of it these days is in offtake agreements, because a lot of the sort of quality is coming out in the future, and a lot of the kind of technologies you're looking for are coming out in the future. And so although we might sign an offtake agreement and that offtake agreement says they'll deliver in 2027, we're not sure if they'll deliver in 2027 or 2028 potentially. And so you're constantly balancing and managing a whole lot of competing priorities that all are leading to fundamentally having a leadership position that's going to improve your reputation, and that leadership position should be one that's going to be delivering the impact in the areas that you prioritise.
Yeah, I mean, out of interest, what is BCG's, I suppose, allocation across the different technologies, roughly, to the extent you can disclose it?
So we, like the stuff that's all really public, so we still do a mix of removals and avoidance, but we're heading to 100% removals by 2030. And we're also heading to $80 per tonne average price by 2030. And we've definitely still got already offtake agreements for that period and beyond. And again, the actual, we don't have this is definitely how many engineered removals or how many DACs or BECs or whatever. We buy from across all the different methodology types pretty much. And we are constantly in discussions with different developers, different sourcing channels, and we're looking at, okay, what is going to be available when, how much is that going to cost, and it's trying to put a jigsaw together so that we're pretty sure we're going to have enough credits in the year that we need to match. And so I'm not sure of the exact numbers right now, but I can assure you that no one knows them for no one knows them for 100% certain out to 2030.
So there's different kinds of buyers, and BCG is a great example of a catalytic buyer. So you make a difference to those different methodologies by engaging early and enabling them to scale, and you accepting the uncertainty in the delivery schedule, for example. Not many do that. When it's transferred to the desk of the treasurer or the CFO, they don't have that patience. They just won't get it delivered. That's why there needs to be fungibility between the credits. If you don't get those credits, then you need to get something else. And therefore you need the commoditization. So that's sort of, so this is not today, unfortunately. This is where we need to get to go. And unfortunately there are forces now, Empire Strikes Back, kind of an approach where people are bringing, for example, a number of sort of additional attributes into the discussion that would get a significant sort of proportion of the attention, and therefore making it very difficult to do the fungible sort of commodity of this asset type.
We are over time. It's been a great discussion. Thank you everybody for staying. Let's give a round of applause to them.
Oh yeah, and don't forget to register for our exciting event on carbon removal budgets on the 31st of July. And we can continue this conversation then.